At exactly 3:26 p.m. on November 14, 1965, 400 North Vietnamese soldiers rose from the elephant grass and charged straight into American lines with one objective: complete annihilation. What happened in the next 10 minutes would become the most savage, desperate, and costly close-quarters battle American forces had faced since the Korean War. This is the story of how 395 men of the 7th Cavalry held a collapsing perimeter against impossible odds, where survival was measured in seconds, and the difference between living and dying was the speed of your reload. Landing Zone X-Ray, a football field-sized clearing hacked into the central highlands of South Vietnam. Surrounded on 3 sides by dense jungle and a mountain the Americans called Chu Pong. For 2 days, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and his vastly outnumbered battalion had been fighting for their lives against a North Vietnamese army regiment that outnumbered them nearly 5-1. They'd held. Barely. The perimeter was tight. Ammunition was running low. Medevac helicopters were pulling out the wounded in shifts. Every man on that landing zone knew they were sitting in a kill box. They just didn't know the hammer was about to fall. At 3:26 p.m., the jungle erupted. Not with mortars, not with distant rifle fire, with screaming. Hundreds of voices screaming in Vietnamese. Human waves pouring out of the tree line like floodwater through a broken dam. North Vietnamese regulars in pith helmets and khaki uniforms, AK-47s firing from the hip, bayonets fixed, running full sprint across open ground directly into Second Platoon's position on the western perimeter. No cover, no hesitation. Just raw, suicidal aggression designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers and terror. The Americans opened fire immediately. M16s on full automatic, M60 machine guns cutting horizontal lines through the charging mass. Men fell, dozens of them. But the wave didn't stop. Behind the first line came a second, behind that a third. The North Vietnamese were stacking their own dead as cover and still advancing. 30 meters, 20, 15. Close enough now to see faces, close enough to see the determination in their eyes, close enough to know that if they reached the foxholes, it would turn into hand-to-hand butchery. Second Platoon's left flank buckled first. A machine gun team took a direct RPG hit. The gun went silent. The assistant gunner was obliterated. The gap in the line opened like a wound, and North Vietnamese soldiers poured through it. 5 men, then 10, then 20. Now they were inside the perimeter. Now they were among the Americans. Now the nightmare scenario every soldier feared was happening in real time. Lieutenant Henry Herrick's platoon, already isolated and cut off to the north, heard the explosions and knew the main perimeter was collapsing. Herrick's men had been surrounded since early afternoon. Dead and dying Americans lay in heaps around their position. They were out of water, nearly out of ammunition. Every few minutes another man took a round. Herrick himself had been shot through the back and was bleeding out in a bomb crater. Still giving orders, still refusing to die until his men were safe. When the sounds of the 326th charge reached them through the jungle, they understood with crushing clarity that no help was coming. They were on their own. The rest of the battalion was fighting for survival. Back at the main perimeter, Hal Moore was sprinting toward the breach. Moore, the battalion commander, the man who'd promised his soldiers he would be the first to set foot on the battlefield and the last to leave, was now running directly into machine gun fire with his radio operator struggling to keep pace. He reached Second Platoon's shattered line and saw what every commander dreads: chaos. Men firing in every direction, wounded screaming for medics, dead sprawled in foxholes. North Vietnamese soldiers 20 feet away throwing grenades. The perimeter wasn't just collapsing, it was disintegrating. Moore grabbed the nearest sergeant by the shoulder and screamed orders over the gunfire. "Plug that gap. Redirect fire. Get the M60 back in action. Pull men from the south side if you have to, but do not let them break through." The sergeant nodded and sprinted into the maelstrom. Moore turned to his radio operator and called in everything he had. Artillery, broken arrow protocol. That meant friendly positions were being overrun. That meant every available aircraft, every gun, every explosive device in theater was to be directed at this single grid coordinate immediately. Danger close. We are about to be annihilated. 4 minutes into the charge, the North Vietnamese had pushed 40 meters into American lines. They were now fighting inside the landing zone itself. A North Vietnamese officer with a pistol shot an American rifleman point blank in the chest. Before he could fire again, another American buried a trench knife in his throat. Men were grappling in the dirt, rifle butts smashing skulls, bayonets punching through ribs. This wasn't warfare. This was murder at arm's length. The American artillery began landing at 5 minutes. High explosive shells impacting so close to friendly positions that shrapnel tore through American foxholes. But it was working. The North Vietnamese advance staggered. Bodies launched into the air, the screaming intensified. But they still didn't retreat. Officers pushed their men forward even as the jungle around them turned into a hurricane of steel and fire. Their orders were clear: take the landing zone or die trying. Most would do both. At 6 minutes, an American machine gunner named Russell Adams stood up from his fighting position, fully exposed, and walked his M60 fire directly into a cluster of North Vietnamese soldiers who'd made it within grenade range of the command post. He killed 11 men in 7 seconds before a burst of AK fire hit him in the legs and dropped him. He crawled back to his gun, reloaded, and kept firing from the ground. When his ammunition bearer was killed, a rifleman with no machine gun training grabbed the belts and fed the gun while Adams held the trigger down until the barrel glowed red. They would both survive. 43 enemy soldiers would not. 7 minutes. The North Vietnamese charge was faltering, but not broken. Bodies stacked 3 deep in places. The elephant grass burned from tracer rounds. Smoke so thick, men were shooting at muzzle flashes and silhouettes. American medics crawled through the kill zone, dragging wounded back to cover while rounds snapped over their heads. One medic, Thomas Cole, made 4 trips into no man's land. On the 5th, he took a round through the shoulder. He crawled back anyway, pulling a wounded lieutenant with him. 8 minutes. Hal Moore was everywhere, directing fire, calling corrections for artillery, physically dragging ammunition boxes to guns that had run dry. His uniform was soaked with blood, none of it his. He stepped over dead North Vietnamese soldiers tangled with dead Americans and felt nothing but cold calculation. How many rounds left? How many men still fighting? How long until the next wave? Because there would be a next wave. There was always a next wave. 9 minutes. The North Vietnamese pulled back. Not retreated, pulled back, regrouping in the tree line, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. The Americans didn't celebrate. They reloaded. They redistributed ammunition from the dead to the living. They stacked bodies to reinforce fighting positions. They waited. Every man on that perimeter knew the mathematics of infantry combat. The enemy had just tested their defenses and found weak points. The next assault would hit those exact spots, and there was nothing they could do but be ready. 10 minutes, 3:36 p.m. The shooting dropped to sporadic rifle fire. Smoke drifted across the landing zone like fog. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn completely, melting back into the jungle as quickly as they'd emerged. Moore walked the perimeter counting bodies. 68 American casualties in 10 minutes, 8 dead, 60 wounded. The North Vietnamese left behind 79 confirmed dead on the field, with blood trails suggesting dozens more dragged away. It was a tactical victory. It felt like a massacre.
In the silence that followed, men sat in their foxholes and shook. Not from fear, from the adrenaline crash, from the realization of how close they'd come. Another 30 seconds, and the North Vietnamese would have reached the command post. Another minute, and the perimeter would have collapsed entirely. Another 2 minutes, and landing zone X-ray would have become a slaughter pen, with American helicopters flying into a hot LZ controlled by enemy forces. The entire battalion would have been annihilated. The battle would have been lost. The war would have been different. But it didn't happen. Because of men like Russell Adams who stood when every instinct screamed to stay down. Because of medics like Thomas Cole who crawled into fire to save strangers. Because of Hal Moore who ran toward the breach instead of away from it. Because 400 exhausted, terrified, outnumbered American soldiers decided that giving ground was not an option, even when giving ground meant staying alive. The battle for landing zone X-ray would rage for 3 more days. The fighting would claim 305 American casualties and an estimated 3,561 North Vietnamese killed or wounded. It would become the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces. It would set the tone for a war that would consume a generation. But the outcome was decided in those 10 minutes, when the line held, when the breach was sealed, when men chose to die in place rather than run.
10 minutes, 600 seconds. The time it takes to brew coffee, the time it takes to drive across town, the time it took to decide whether the United States Army could stand and fight against a determined enemy willing to accept catastrophic losses to achieve victory. The answer, written in blood on a small clearing in the Central Highlands, was yes. But the cost of that answer would haunt every survivor for the rest of their lives. Because in war, 10 minutes can feel like 10 hours, and 10 minutes can mean the difference between a battalion that goes home and a battalion that never leaves the jungle. At 3:26 p.m. on November 14, 1965, that difference was measured in the courage of men who had every reason to break and every right to run, but who stood their ground when the world caught fire around them. That is the story of the deadliest 10 minutes of the Vietnam War. Not the bloodiest day, not the longest battle, but the 10 minutes when everything hung in the balance, and the balance could have tipped either way. The 10 minutes when survival was a choice made second by men who were too scared to be heroes, but who became heroes anyway.
And in the decades since, when veterans of LZ X-ray gather and grow quiet, it's not the days of fighting they remember most clearly. It's those 10 minutes, when the grass caught fire and the jungle screamed, and the only thing standing between life and annihilation was the man beside you, who was just as terrified as you were, but who stayed anyway. That's what 10 minutes can mean. That's what 10 minutes can cost.
That's what 10 minutes can decide, when the stakes are measured in lives and the only choice left is whether to stand or fall. The men at LZ X-Ray chose to stand. For 10 minutes that felt like forever, they held the line. And because they did, they survived to tell the story you just heard. The story of the longest 10 minutes of their lives.